Good evening. It's Sunday evening, July 5th, and I'm feeling well enough to record this video for you now. It's been a rough 24 hours or so, but Motrin, Tylenol help a lot. I don't know exactly what the outcome will be for this illness, but I promise to continue to work and serve from my isolation room as I seek to serve you as your pastor, and will do whatever I can from here to minister to you. So today's message is how did we get here? And kind of recounts our journey, if you will, from being planted 111 years ago in November, and to making the decisions that we're making in this era of the church life. We start with Proverbs chapter 29, verse 18. Where there is no revelation, where there is no vision, the people cast off restraint, or the people perish. But blessed is he who keeps the law. It was a special called business meeting in August of 2018, almost 2 years ago, that in that meeting you voted to allow the Board of Elders to examine all of the resources, both financial resources, cash holdings, and real property resources, to come to you with a resolution about how to use them to build the kingdom of God. Then in November of 2018, you unanimously agreed for the Board of Elders to seek the best way to utilize those resources for future ministry. As part of that process, we conducted an accurate assessment of the property value, and then in March of 2019 we listed the real property for sale with Howard Johnson Realtors, thinking that God may be calling us to relocate, and that our greatest asset, the property itself, could propel us to a new life cycle for the church. In March of 2020, the General Assembly voted for sale of the property to Hobbs Realty, and we're nearing closing date, August 14th. The purchaser has completed their due diligence, inspection of the land, and all the things that they need for their purposes. But I suppose I should go back even further, for this congregation has been gradually dying over the course of at least the last 30 years. In part, this organizational death was hastened by the natural aging of the membership and the inability to attract and keep young people. Oh, lost my place. By the way, the inability to attract and keep young people is not a phenomenon that's new to this congregation. There are many examples of congregations that have few young families, 41 to 55-year-olds, and in fact, the 56 to 70-year-olds are often missing as well. The baby boomers dropped out of church shortly after high school, and baby busters didn't stay much longer than that. Many of them dropped out before they finished high school. We in the Church of God have also been victim of our own theology. For if there's only one church and the unity of all believers, then our loyalty lies with the one God rather than with a particular congregation or a group of people. So even if we do not fall away or drift away from God, we have tended to drift from the fellowship where we were raised, because we understood It's not about the name on the door. It's about the fellowship in the heart and the fellowship of the people. Those congregations in the Church of God which have been greatly successful have often been ones, at least in the last couple of decades, those who were able to engage their community with ministries that were not strictly Bible study oriented. So they did other things to attract people to the church, or they had other ministries to attract people to the church. And then once they arrived there, then they had a discipleship program in place to train them and to disciple them. Enough, I suppose, of the generalities of things. For the most part, our congregation, even under our current leadership, has been void of a compelling vision. Now, it's not that we haven't tried. Most of us have sought over the last 15 years to engage the culture as servants in other ways. We've volunteered, we've served, we've tried to make a difference and an impact for the kingdom, and there has been kingdom benefit. There has been little in the way of benefit to the local congregation. That is not to say that there has been none, for that would not be true. There have been a few faithful families who have joined with us in these last years. But still, having said that, the growth rate has not outpaced the death rate. As an example for you, the lack of compelling vision, allow me to tell you of my experience with an organization called Healthy Growing Churches. HGC has contracted with Mississippi for several years to help with church planting efforts, and more recently with revitalization of existing churches to reorient them to our primary mission of making disciples. As part of my involvement, I was meeting in a monthly Zoom window with Tom Plank, the chief catalyst for the organization. And over the years, I was given assignments to read books on vision, and I struggled to put into words exactly why we existed as something different and how we can leave an impact on our community in this generation. I struggled even to understand what some of those questions meant and how to explore them. Then in 2018, Greg Wines and Dan Turner published a critical book, Dying to Restart. In that work, these men laid out the difficulties of dying churches and looked at options for those who desired to help flailing congregations. Plus, Dan had the experience of leading a church congregation in Washington, D.C. to health through a season of death and resurrection. In their book, they describe the choices that churches must make. The path taken by many churches is just simply slow death. This choice acknowledges that there's a problem, but it does not have the energy or enthusiasm to challenge the established patterns. From a medical perspective, these churches are often just on life support. Sometimes consciousness has even evaded them, and they're just being taken care of by people outside, helping them with food and nourishment. They continue to exist, but they don't really have any vibrancy or quality of life. Their budgets continue to drop, and eventually they can no longer hire any full-time staff. They move to bivocational ministers and cut programs that would lead to growth. Eventually, they wind up with just a handful of individuals who hold on, longing for the good old days. And this death can take years, especially if the congregation is debt-free. A second path that the congregation may take is to turn over their resources to a state or national agency to be used for planting new churches, either in the local community or across the country or around the world. The legacy restart is sacrificial and beneficial. It's beautiful to sacrifice what life is left so that someone else might live. It recognizes and realizes that someone somewhere needs the resources we hold and willingly gives them away so that others might hear the good news and follow God. But this path is hard for those who have invested blood, sweat, and tears into a particular location, fellowship, or ministry. Members of these congregations usually choose to go and join another church that basically does church the way they did church, but they're not quite as far along on the death curve. Their hope is that their death will happen before another congregation dies. No one enjoys seeing multiple congregations go through death. This type of death has happened in Mississippi over the past 15 years. The Bethel congregation, located somewhere between Collinsville and Philadelphia, I never had the opportunity to actually visit that congregation, but they closed. They had just 10 people, and they realized that they were not doing much. The pastor of the church in Philadelphia was coming, preaching in their location, and then going back to Philadelphia, and they knew that was not sustainable for the long term and would not cause them to grow. All of their resources went to the state, who disposed of them, sold them, and the funds were given to assist in ministry at Camp Dixon. An additional congregation had the foresight to leave a legacy. A small congregation of believers in Tupelo, Mississippi, which had been a church plant of the Home Missions Board, closed its doors and turned their property back over to the Home Missions Board, who is currently using the proceeds of that legacy gift to explore revitalization efforts around the state. It was the hope of the late Earl Wheatley that the Home Missions Board would plant at least one new congregation before his death. He had mapped out a course to start a congregation in one of the fastest growing areas of the state, Petal. But that failed to materialize, and his death removed the impetus for a traditional kind of church plant. A third path that a group of believers might take is merger. Now, there are at least two kinds of merger that a church might choose to do. The first one is for a church to merge with a healthy church. So the church that is dying essentially gives over control to a healthy local church who takes over their property, who takes over their ministry, and the healthy church has a healthy DNA. They've been growing over the past years. They're financially viable. They've found a way to impact the current culture, and so they transplant some of their leadership to this dying congregation and transform it into a model of itself. This kind of restart requires that there be a healthy congregation nearby who could benefit from having an influx of older members and assume ministry for those individuals. And I thought about that. I had conversations with Ben Steers at North Park Church about the possibility of them adopting us as a mission platform and bringing the vibrancy of the North Park congregations, one of the healthiest congregations in the state of Mississippi, to Laurel and transforming the way we did that. We decided not to do that for a number of reasons. But this week's announcement by Pastor Ben that he would be leaving the North Park congregation and returning to his home, Kansas, for a call to ministry seems to be a wise decision that we made, not to start on that path. Um, this kind of vision brings new life to an old place. But another type of merger happens when two dying congregations merge. And these sometimes work out, sometimes they don't. Usually when dying congregations merge with other dying congregations, they just extend the tail of death rather than extending the life of the congregation. It's difficult for them. They may be able to hire a full-time pastor again because they have sufficient number of tithers and givers, but they never really achieve outreach into the community. They never really achieve attraction to people who aren't part of one of those two fellowships. The last path for a group of believers to take is called a resurrection restart. This one can actually be the most difficult, for it involves unlearning how we do church and learning to sacrifice what our hopes and dreams are and desires so that the kingdom might spread in new and unique ways. In a resurrection restart, a core group of an existing congregation agrees to utilize those resources and start over, start fresh, build a new paradigm. And it also asks some of those who aren't interested in building that new paradigm to go and find a place where they're comfortable, a place where they fit, a place that ministers to them according to their need. One of the reasons Tom and Dan write, or rather Greg and Dan write, one of the reasons this is challenging is the work it takes to acclimate the remnant group with the culture of the new target group. So we're reaching a new group of people. We have to begin to think like that new group of people. If we desire to reach those who are currently unchurched, we'll have to consider what they might like in a worship service or a group fellowship, and we might not like that at all. Pardon me. Dan and Greg write, when one vision begins to wane, God sends new leaders to chart a new course forward. But unfortunately, most churches struggle to reinvent themselves and to accept what it will take to start a new life cycle, to recontextualize the gospel for a changing world. When I read this book, it changed something in me. I knew that the time was close for our fellowship to make a choice. Will we die the long death of doing nothing or doing the same things, expecting different results? Will we leave a legacy that we will not control to a people we do not know? Will we merge with another group which is growing or another one that's also struggling? Will we take the harder course of resurrection, which means going through death to get to new life on the other side? As a shepherd, I want you to understand how much I love each of you. I have great respect for you. I have great love for you. Your kindness, your dedication, your history. You've done all that was asked of you, but many of you, quite frankly, are weary. I would love to be with you and serve you until your last breath is breathed. However, I'm reticent just to stand by and allow the resources that are at our disposal to go away. And then someday, the last person locks the door for the last time and hands the keys over to the state minister or the home missions board. And in part, that's because I also know that the Church of God needs a presence in Laurel, Mississippi. We need to be the church in Laurel. And yes, there are a lot of great ministries starting in Laurel right now. But I think that we need to continue being here. I love this community. It's become home to us. And I'm hard pressed to turn my back on it, knowing that there are so many people who in our community who don't attend church. And the reason, simply enough, is because they don't see the relevance of a traditional church style. It's not that they don't see the relevance of God in their lives necessarily, but it's because they don't see the relevance of the traditional church style. I'm more willing to try and stay, to do something different, to restart, if you will. Over the course of the last 2 years, God has been birthing a vision in my heart, a compelling vision, one that has given me an energy and excitement that I haven't felt in a very long time. It's been probably 30 years since I tried to reform an organization. And this is one that's given me energy and excitement. And I finally felt able to articulate the guiding values that would propel us forward. They just flowed. Something changed all of a sudden where I couldn't understand what they were talking about before. Now all of a sudden they just flowed. I've shared those with you in our Wednesday groups over the last year. Thankfully, I could see as well how the use of capital could help us invest in, develop some other income-producing ministries. Now that sounds weird, but it's really part of the future for the church. Ministries that can be self-sustaining and can also fund back to the primary mission of making disciples, to reach the lost. God has given me a vision of a fresh expression of the church, the ecclesia, that is compelling and vibrant, and I believe it will be attractive to the world. In part, I believe that because as I've talked to many people in our community about the vision, they all thought it was a wonderful idea. Next week, I'll share with you the values that I believe can guide us forward in the resurrection as we reinvent ourselves, as we start a new life cycle, and as we recontextualize the gospel for a changing world. But for now, I think I'm tired and I need a nap. God bless you. Go in peace and be blessed.